Hello and welcome to Love and the Planets, and I'm Margaret Gray in Dublin.
And I'm Armand Diaz in New York.
Gosh, Armand, we've got another week of pretty intense changes in the sky, really. And I know we've been saying this for a while. And, as we were talking earlier, a lot of people are just saying, when are things going to lighten up a bit? And usually with the new moon, it would kind of feel a little lighter and a little, easier on relationships because there's something about that newness and starting something new. But it's not quite like that this week, is it?
No, and we had a few weeks there when we thought it was going to be a little bit lighter weather, and perhaps it was a little bit lighter, but it didn't feel, it was lighter, but it didn't feel light, and that's and it's a bit of a thing. This year has been a year we've been for relationships, the Venus retrograde, and she's been retrograding in a part of the zodiac where she's been tangling with Uranus, and there's just been some very disruptive energy out there, and I feel that it's kind of it's been a pretty difficult time, and I don't see things getting all that much lighter in the coming week.
No, not at all, because even though it's a new moon in Gemini, and Gemini, of course, is air and it has that lightness about it, it's a lot about communication. So if there weren't other things happening, which we'll talk about in a moment, we would say, well, it's a lovely light new moon, a great time to communicate. However, remembering that Gemini, of course, there's the light and the dark twin, I think in this case, by dark, I mean the shadow twin, I would say that it's more likely that shadow issues are going to come up because, of course, of the Venus in Aries square Pluto in Capricorn. So here is Aphrodite just out of her retrograde, as you said earlier, and wham, she goes into the underworld.
Yeah, Venus just left the shadow of her retrograde a few days before, really on May 21st, someplace right around there. And she just gets out of the shadow of her retrograde, and you feel like, wow, we're finally free to get moving. And then we wane into the new moon, and boom, she hits Pluto. It's really kind of like, like the shackles are off and still tripping, still falling over. New moons it's a time of endings and beginnings, usually in a fairly subtle way. It's just kind of release of one thing and moving into another incubation. And yet, with Venus and Pluto, I'm feeling that, it may be, again, more endings than beginnings.
Well, I often think, with Venus and Pluto, in aspect to each other, here we have Aphrodite, who, is very connected, of course, to relationships. And then Pluto, we have Hades, the god of the underworld. And I think of the myth of Inanna, who goes down, into the underworld, to visit her sister Ereshkigal. And I think there's really something about needing to release things, letting go, surrendering, And I think in terms of relationships, it's maybe a time where we're invited to let go of relationships that maybe are not working or are not really authentic to who we are, not connected. So maybe to be aware that if people are losing relationships, I've heard a lot of people losing friendships as well as intimate relationships, that maybe they weren't the real thing, that maybe, this is really crunch time where we've got to figure out, is this really, are these the people I want to be surrounded with or not? And maybe to say, well, maybe they're more acquaintances and that's okay. But I think that's part of it. And the more we go willingly with that letting go, maybe the easier that process is.
It's true. I mean, sometimes we have to recognize that there's not everything is always and forever. On the other hand, though, we're talking about Venus and Aries. This is a very forward-moving energy. This is a real go for it type of energy. And square to Pluto, there could be relationships where we feel the love, we feel the togetherness, and maybe it is a bit of a strain from society, from culture, from one's friends, even from officialdom in some places. And this is the kind of, no, we are doing our thing, and you're not going to limit us. Pluto is not going to limit us. We're going to fight. Aries is a fighting sign. We're going to fight for what we are and what we want. We're going to fight for love. So that's a possibility as well. Um,
That's true. And I think, if we look at the news, we're seeing in Chechnya that, they're trying to stop, of course, the murder of gay men who have been arrested and so on. And I just recently saw a post where, in England, in some really expensive private schools, they're allowing boys to wear skirts. So they're really challenging that kind of binary way of looking at sexuality. So maybe this is the start of some of the good things that can come out of this Venus square Pluto, where, there is a challenge, and where, again, we're looking at what's real, what really matters, and within that there's also the love. What's real love, and what am I prepared to do for love? So that might also come to the fore. How loyal am I to my love, and would I do anything for it?
Yeah, and again, that Venus, Pluto, and it is in Gemini. This is the new moon in Gemini, so it is in a sense a kind of the potential for the birth and beginning of these kinds of movements and these kinds of changes that allow for, Gemini is duality. And so exactly reshuffling the images that we have of the polarities and so on. I think that's a real great potential that is in this. Although, these are big collective things as much as they affect us personally. These are big collective things. And, sometimes there's one thing going on at the collective level and then something very different going on in our personal lives. And, it's a little hard. And that's another Gemini thing, shuttling back and forth between those two perspectives. And, what's real and what's important at one level and what's real and important at the other.
And how to also take care of our relationships within that, because I think there's a lot, relationships are getting bombarded a lot with the external world, what's going on politically, economically. So, how to, in some ways, try and create a little bit of a boundary around it and really remember the basics of nurturing our relationships and just taking care of them and not taking it out with our loved ones, which is so easy. We're human. And so it's easier with people close to, it's easier to kind of project our frustrations. So maybe to really, not maybe, but definitely I would say to be a little more watchful of that in the next few weeks, because there is such a lot of intensity around.
Well, I agree. Although I got to say that after we come out of that new moon, we're going to be heading into the weekend. For a good part of the week, for the end part of the weekend, we have the moon in Cancer, which has a very protective, sort of conservative type of vibe. It's nurturing, I'll give you that, but it's still a bit protected. And what happens as we get to the end of the weekend, and we'll be feeling it all weekend, Mars in Gemini opposed to Saturn in Sagittarius. And, Mars and Saturn, that's always driving with the emergency brake on.
Yes, and also it's squaring Chiron. So that configuration is really starting with the new moon, which adds again to kind of a sense of, I would describe it as a sense of battling, battling around differences in beliefs. However, the Chiron, of course, has the two options. It can either help to heal some of those, or it can, it will certainly in the process bring up some old wounds. So I think that's all kind of percolating underneath. And as you say, is kind of really going to come to the fore next week, which, we'll talk about certainly more in our next recording, but it just adds another flavor to it. Now, one thing, however, which is kind of, one of the nicer aspects on Sunday, where Mercury in Taurus is sextile Neptune in Pisces. So that has, now there could be a little confusion around it, of course, but it might be a little bit of a day to kind of just kind of also have a little bit of space to dream as well, or daydream, or relax, or go for a swim, or lie on a beach somewhere.
If you can put things in soft focus, that's great. Although, then there's also, Mercury, Neptune could also be really, going off, and taking a thought and running with it and kind of getting lost in it, especially with that Mars, Saturn. I feel once again that there's this kind of burst of energy from the new moon, Venus, Pluto, and then Mars and Saturn are sort of putting a little bit of a drag, amping up the tension. And I think that so much of this year with the retrogrades that we've had and so on, so much of this year has been that sense of building tension and, little releases here and there, but not a real, taking the lid off the pot for good at any level. And, maybe that's a good thing. I'm not sure what's going to happen when stuff finally does start to let go. But it's a little hard when you have the sense of, got to do something. Something's got to give, and nothing really does.
It's so true. And I think back to the basics when things are a little bit in turmoil in the sky, grounding ourselves. I think it's not easy at the moment, but really to try and stay centered, do exercise, get out in fresh air, listen to music, go and see go to a nice art gallery, use the arts, the creative arts and physical exercise to just try and release some of these tensions so that they don't kind of build up within relationships, and really, really check, what we're about to say, because it's so easy, especially with the new moon in Gemini, to just say things impulsively, even though Mercury's in Taurus, and then oh my goodness, why did I say that? So just to be extra cautious and to take care of ourselves and our relationships a little more.
Well, we'll see you next week. Let's hope.
Yes, absolutely. Bye, Armand.
Bye-bye, Margaret.